Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 12 through 22 in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Back in the previous classes, we looked at Genesis 1 through 11. We saw that there were four events that were predominant: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Those things all happened in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Now, as we come to the rest of the book, starting in chapter 12, actually starting at the last few verses of chapter 11, we're going to see four people with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The first section, we had the whole human race. Even though the whole human race at times was only two people or a few people, but it's really looking at everyone. And now we focus just on the family of Abraham. We start off chapter 11, verse 27. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram. Notice he's called Abram here. I have on the chart Abraham. His name is going to be changed to Abraham, but right now is Abram. The way you would pronounce it would really be Avram. Same word, just different, slightly different pronunciation. The B and the V are sort of interchangeable. Not going to get into details there. Ab is the word for father, and Ram can be either like a high place, father of a high place. Might remember that we talked about ziggurats. It might be a throwback to that. Or Avram could also be exalted father, like high father. I'll let you decide which one you think it might be. But notice Terah became the father of Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Lot's going to play a part in our story as well. So he has to be mentioned here. We go on, verse 28. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldees. So they start in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. That's in Mesopotamia. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And verse 30 is the problem. Every story has to have a problem, or there's no plot. You can say he was born and he lived happily ever after. That'd be a really boring story. But here, the problem is verse 30. Sarai was barren; she had no child, and that sets up the problem that the rest of the Abram story is going to be discussing. Now, to be barren for a woman might not be a happy situation in our culture. In that culture of the ancient world, that was tragic. Because one of the key things that women did was to bear children. And remember, your children were the ones that took care of you when you were older. They didn't have Social Security or nursing homes or things like that. So that was built into the structure of their society. But she can have no children. She's barren. She has no children. And remember, we talked in a previous class about an honor and shame society as opposed to a right and wrong society. There's nothing wrong with being barren, but there is something in the ancient world dishonorable and shameful about being barren. And so this is seen as a real problem. Verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldees in order to enter the land of Canaan. Notice, I don't know if Terah had that idea, I'm going to the land, but at least we, the reader, know that. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years. That's a good, respectable age. And Terah died in Haran. So here we are, looking at a map of the Middle East. Notice Ur down there in southern Mesopotamia, and they're going to leave Ur and they're going to go to Haran. Now I've been told that the name Haran means crossroads. I'm not sure about that, but that's what's been told to me in the past. I think that might work because it certainly is sort of the crossroads. If you're going to Hatti, or if you're going to Mesopotamia, if you're going down to Egypt, you remember you're not going to go across the desert. You're gonna follow the water. And so they go to Haran, and that is where they settle. Chapter 12, verse 1, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. Notice from your country, the Hebrew word there for country is aretz. However, it's also the Hebrew word for, notice how you talk about the land, that's the word aretz too, the land. So the land, the country, which is it? It's both. In fact, back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The word earth there was Aretz, the up there place and the down here place, the sky and the land. Um, and so that, they get a lot of mileage from their Hebrew words. But we're going to see another word in a second. So hold that thought. Continue, and I will make you, God speaking to Abram, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so you shall be a blessing. Notice the double blessing. I'm going to bless you, and you'll be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth. Now, this time it's a different Hebrew word. This time it's Adam. Adamah, I'm sorry. Adamah, remember, Adam, that's the word for man, also the name of the first man, because he was taken from Adamah. And that's the term that we see here, all the families of the earth. If you want to say of the ground, it's a synonym for aretz, but they basically mean the same thing. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so they had already left Ur and gone to Haran. And now we read that Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew. Lot's father had died, so Abram is taking Lot with him. And you almost get the impression maybe this is going to be sort of his nephew, but maybe serving as a bit of an adopted son. Now that's not stated, so that's just my guess as to their planned relationship. And so he takes Sarai and Lot, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So from Haran, they come down to this little tiny land of Canaan. And we're blowing up Canaan on our map. We're focusing in on Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now, and notice, the Canaanite was then in the land. So they get to Canaan, and God said, I'm going to give you a land, but there's other people already there. The Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. Now, when he says to your descendants, literally that's to your seed. Remember how we had the promise of the seed way back in Genesis chapter 3? Zerah is the word for seed. The same word that's used here, although for some reason they translated descendants. I know why they did, because if they said seed, you might be thinking like, is this a plant seed or something like that? That's what it means, to your descendants. But I want you to catch the repetition of the term. So that Abram is going to be given this land, but not yet, because there's already people living there. So he built an altar there. Now, this is Abram who built an altar there to the Lord, who has appeared to him. And so this idea of building an altar is mentioned here, but we're going to see this happen a number of times, where Abram comes to the land, he built an altar, he moved somewhere else, he built an altar. Sometimes we'll read he built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. We don't see that right here, but we will. He'll go down to Egypt, and he'll come back, and he'll build an altar and call upon the name of the Lord. He'll go to a different place. He'll build an altar, call upon the name of the Lord. And at this point, he has Lot with him, although that's not going to remain, because when they get back from Egypt, they're going to go down to Egypt because there's trouble here, there's famine, and they'll come back and they will separate. And you say, I thought that Lot was going to be his adopted son, and it turns out not to be the case. So here we have Lot, the nephew of Abram, and he separates from Abram, and now Abram has no adopted son. However, we read in Genesis 15 that he had as his heir, his chief steward, Eliezer of Damascus. That was the custom in that day. If you didn't have any children, no family, then what you could do is you could take one of your most trusted servants, one of your most trusted slaves, and you make him your heir. And so he's going to be your servant, your slave. He's gonna serve you. But when you die, he gets everything, and he carries on sort of the family. Eliezer of Damascus. Now, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 4, the Lord shows up to Abram, and he speaks to him, and he says, behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, this man Eliezer of Damascus, but one who shall come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir. So it wasn't Lot. It wasn't And now we're told it's not going to be Eliezer of Damascus. It's going to be one who comes from you. Now that's going to lead to speculation. Okay, it's got to be Abram's going to be the father. Does Sarai necessarily have to be the mother? But we'll see that in just a minute. Meantime, here in Genesis 15, God enters enters into a covenant ceremony. Now we see the ceremony described, and everybody would know what that is that lived in the ancient world. This was a common thing, where God says to Abram, He says, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon." Then He brought all these to Him, that is to God, and cut them in two. And you say, what is this? They're having lunch? Is this barbecue? No, this is actually how you would cut a covenant. Now, notice the word covenant wasn't used right here. We're going to see it used a little bit later. But right now, they're going through a covenant ceremony, and Abram would have gotten that. And he takes the animals and he cuts them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And so what he does is he cuts the animals, and what you would do is you'd cut the animals, and then in a covenant ceremony, you would separate them, and the parties entering into the covenant would pass between the pieces. And that's what we see here in verse 17. And it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. Now, Abram doesn't. In fact, God caused a deep sleep to fall on him, so he really can't do it. But a flaming torch and a smoking oven passes between the pieces, and you get the idea already. That's the presence of God. That symbolizes God. Now, the question I always ask, why is God described as a smoking oven and a flaming torch? And there's an answer there. And the answer is found in the question of who is writing this story, not who are the characters in the story where it's coming about. That's Abram. But who's writing the story, and to whom is he writing it? And the author, the human author, is Moses. And his audience, the people to whom he is writing, are the Israelites who have come out of Egypt. And if they're in their camp and they look out their tent, the first thing they see, if it's daytime, there's a pillar of smoke. If it's nighttime, there's a flaming torch. And that signifies the presence of God. And that's what they see passing between the pieces. So this is very relevant to them. Now we read in verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant, literally as he cut a covenant with Abram. And so God is entering into this covenant with Abram. Now later on we're going to see, we're going to return to that covenant idea, but it's seen here, and then some promises are given. And notice the smoking oven, the flaming torch, that's the presence of God, the way the Israelites would have understood it in the wilderness. Now, we already saw that this quest for a son, because Sarai is barren, and it wasn't going to be Lot because he had already left. He had already separated from Abram. And it wasn't going to be, now we found out, it's not going to be Eliezer of Damascus. So who's it going to be? Well, they come up with a plan. It has to be somebody who comes from Abram, but God hadn't said it has to come from Abram and Sarah. And there is a custom in the Middle East at that point in history where if a wife could not bear a son, if she was barren, then actually in some places, there's a place in Mesopotamia called Nuzi, and we found these tablets that give some of their laws and regulations. And the Nuzi tablets actually say it was the responsibility of a wife who was barren to take a slave girl or somebody like that and give that slave girl to her husband where she could bear children through that slave girl. And that's what they do. So they take Hagar. Hagar is an Egyptian slave girl belonging to Sarai, and she is given, Hagar is given to Abram, and they come together and they have a child, and that child will now be Ishmael. And Abram thinks, hey, this is great. Now I finally have a son. And then God shows up and says, that's not going to be the one. And God shows up, and actually it's the Lord. What happens is Abram has 3 visitors, and he finds out eventually one of them is I don't know if I should call it an incarnation, but one of them is described as the Lord. and the other two we're going to find out are angels, but I'm not going to focus on them right now. God comes and he has this meeting with Abram, and he says, that's not going to be your heir. It's not going to be Ishmael. Sarai is going to have a son, and Sarai's in the other room. Remember, they're living in tents. They're nomads. They're living in tents, and she's sort of listening at the keyhole of the tent. I know tents don't have keyholes, but she's listening. You know, tents don't carry sound very well, and she hears this that she's going to have a son, and she's been barren her whole life, and by now she's quite elderly. And she just starts snickering at, she just laughs at the, and God says, I don't know if he hears her, he says, why were you laughing? And, oh, I'm not laughing. Yes, you are, and that's what you're going to call him. You're going to call him Isaac, or they would say Yitzhak. We sometimes, and I'm usually going to use the anglicized form of these names, Isaac or Yitzhak, and it means laughter, and you're going to name him Laughter. And sure enough, that's going to happen. Now, I want you to see the entire flow of thought in the Abram story. So back in chapter 12, verse 1, we'd had promises given, where Abram is called to leave his family, and the promise of the seed and the promise of the land. Then we had where he had come into Canaan, but there was a famine in the land, so he had gone down to Egypt. And he gets down to Egypt, and he says about Sarai, she's not my wife, she's my sister. He was afraid that somebody would murder him to take his wife. I'm not sure if that was an issue, but that's what he was afraid of, at least. And then they come back into the land after this, and Lot and Abram are having issues because they've got lots of flocks, lots of herds. And remember, the land is already fully occupied. There's Canaanites everywhere. And between them and the Canaanites, there's no room for them to be together. So they negotiate, and Abram says, look, you decide which part of the land you want to go to. I'll take what's left over. And Lot looks around, and he notices the very fertile area of the Jordan Rift Valley. And he says, I'm no fool, I'm going down there. And he goes down there, and Abram settles somewhere else. But then as things would happen, in chapter 14, there's a band of raiders that come from Mesopotamia and capture Lot and the city in which he's settled, the city of Sodom. And Abram goes to rescue both Lot, and in the process rescues Sodom as well. And it's a delightful rescue story. Next, we look at that covenant ceremony that we just saw in chapter 15 with the animals, where Abram prepares a sacrifice for the covenant ceremony, and he cuts the animals, and the presence of God, the smoking oven, the burning torch pass between the pieces, and God gives a series of promises about descendants and the land, and yes, you're going to have a child that you're going to have, not just an adopted child or anything like that. And so they decide, well, if Abram's going to have a child, didn't say anything about Sarah having a child, but there was a law back then, and the law stated. Now, this was not in Canaan. This had been back in Mesopotamia. We've actually read about this from a town called Nuzi. So these tablets, called the Nuzi tablets, give what it wasn't just a custom; it was actually a law, where a wife who was barren was required, at least in that place, to go out and get a slave girl and give the slave girl to her husband to have a child by the slave girl, and that would be considered his child now. And so she does this. Sarah has a slave girl named Hagar, and she gives Hagar to Abraham, and she becomes pregnant, and she's going to have Ishmael. Now, after this, God shows up again in Genesis chapter 17, and God gives a promise to Abraham. And this time, he actually talks about the covenant again, but this time changes Abraham's name as part of that covenant ceremony. So you have the covenant laid out again this time, and Abram's name will be changed from Abram to Abraham. Avram, we said, was father of a high place or exalted father. Now it's going to be father of a multitude, and signifying that there's going to be a whole nation. And Sarai's name is changed too to Sarah. Now, I'm not so sure about the meaning there. They both seem to mean, Sarai and Sarah both. Sar is just the word for prince, and then put a feminine ending, and now it's princess. So I don't know that the meaning has changed. I used to think so, and then I learned Hebrew, and I found out that wasn't the case. But now we have both Abraham and Ishmael who were circumcised, So they're given this covenant sign. Remember how we'd had the rainbow as a sign of the Noahic covenant? That was a very public sign. Everybody can go look at a rainbow. This is a very private sign. This is on your body, hidden privately where no one can see it. And, and nobody except maybe your wife, and that's it. Because it's a promise having to do with the seed. And so it's circumcision, and it's a cut on the body. And all of the males in Abraham's household, with servants, slaves, any male, is going to be circumcised, and they are. Next, we see God showing up, and this time it's with two other beings. We find out that they are angels, two companions. And initially, it's like um, Abraham has these three visitors, and it's only into the story that he gets it through, and we learn and he learns that one of these is somehow God in an incarnation in the flesh. God is a spirit, but here he shows up in the flesh, and the other two leave, and we find out later on they're angels. And God prepares a meal, and God promises that Sarah will give birth to a child. That yes, Abraham's going to have an heir, but it's not going to be Ishmael that he already has. It will be another child. And as they are having this conversation, remember they're living in tents, and Sarah's she's listening through the keyhole. She doesn't have to do that very difficult because tents are not soundproof, and she's listening in, and she hears this, and she starts laughing at the very idea of her, because she's now an old lady, and she's never been able to have children, but now that she's going to have a child, she just laughs, and God says, "Why are you laughing?" And I'm not laughing. Well, yes, you are, and you're going to call him Isaac. And so that takes place here in chapter 18. But then in that same conversation, God tells Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah, these cities of the plain, are going to be destroyed. And Abraham knows that Lot is there. Yes, he had rescued Lot, but Lot had gone back there again. And so now Abraham begins to negotiate with God and say, well, if there are 50 righteous people, are you still going to destroy the city? And God says, no, if not, if there's 50 righteous. Well, how about 45 and 40 and 30 and 20? And finally gets down to just a handful. And God says, no, I won't destroy the city if there's even a few. And then we find out, now Abraham doesn't know this, but we find out because the camera shifts down to Sodom, and these two angels have shown up in Sodom, and they tell Lot, they meet with Lot, and they tell him, the city's going to be destroyed. And you put it together as a reader, there weren't even a handful that were righteous. The entire city was full of wickedness. And so the angels, notice, Abraham had negotiated with God about not destroying the city, but the city is going to be destroyed because those criteria weren't met. But what Abraham really wants is the rescue of Lot, and God's going to give that. So God answers not his request, but the idea behind his request. I think it's a delightful way that God answers the prayer. But notice there's a rescue story then. Next, we're going to have another sojourn, this time in Gerar, the land of the Philistines. Again, there's going to be a she's my sister, not my wife, she's my sister. And then finally, we're going to see the promises are fulfilled. Isaac is born, and Hagar and Ishmael are sent out, and Isaac is offered on the altar, which we'll look at in just a second. But I want you to see the pattern here. See, we had the sojourn in Egypt back in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, and now a sojourn in Gerar much later. Sojourn, sojourn. There's some repetition, there's some parallelism here, and that's what I want you to see. Likewise, there were two rescue stories where Abram had gone down. First of all, there had been negotiations, and then Abram had rescued Lot and the people of Sodom. And then there was negotiations between God and Abram in chapter 18, and angels had been sent to rescue Lot and destroy Sodom. So negotiations followed by rescue. And then notice there had been Hagar and Ishmael in chapter 16, where Ishmael was born. And then there had been Abraham and Ishmael being circumcised. So the entire story of Abraham is following this flow of thought of doublets, of parallels, sort of like a big inverse parallel with the Abrahamic covenant in the middle. That's the pivotal point. And the climactic scene, now there's more about Abraham later on, but the climactic scene here is when Isaac is going to be offered on the altar. So we're going to go now and look at that section in chapter 22, where Isaac is offered. It begins in chapter 22, verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And God tells him, You're going to go and offer your son, your only son. Now you say, wait a second, what about Ishmael? Well, Ishmael wasn't around anymore. So it's going to be your special son. Can I call it that? So verse 22, he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Now, this is the first time that the land of Moriah has been mentioned. When we get to 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, we're going to read that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. I think it's the same place where the Lord had appeared to his father David. So the land of Moriah, or in Chronicles, it's the Mount Moriah. Tradition has it, and I think tradition is correct here, that he goes to the land of Moriah, and there's a mountain there. And notice, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now, the idea of offering up your son on an altar, that was paganism. That's something that the pagans did. And later on, God's going to say, don't ever do that. And yes, I told Abraham to do it, but I stopped him. It was a test of faith. It wasn't a exercise in sacrifice because Isaac isn't going to be offered on the altar. Abraham's going to be ready to do it. And so Abraham responds in faith, and he goes there. And then remember, this is going to be the place where eventually the temple is going to be built. We're going to see the temple on this mountain, but not yet. Right now, it's just a bare mountain. And if you go there today, you'll see what they call the Dome of the Rock. It's a holy place, not just to Jews and to Christians. It's a holy place to the Muslims too, for a different reason. And if you go there, you'll see this big giant dome. But verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So he takes wood. Sort of interesting. You see Isaac actually carrying the wood up the hill. Reminds me of somebody else who carried wood up to a hill in order to be sacrificed. That's a familiar story. That's a familiar pattern, especially if you're a Christian. Well, he gets there and he places Isaac on the altar and he binds him and he's ready to do it. And suddenly God interrupts him and says, Abraham, Abraham, and he's listening. So he says yes. And notice Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering in place of his son. So God provides a substitute that will die in place of his son. Now, what I want you to see is that, notice, he went and looked, because you probably read that and sort of passed over that, but the Hebrew word there, ra'ah, and I only mention it, that's a correct translation. I only mention it because the same word's going to be translated a little differently in the next verse. So he raised his eyes and looked, and he saw the ram. To the next verse, and Abraham called the name of that place. Now, my translation says, the Lord will provide. But the Hebrew says, it's the same word, the Lord will see. Look, see, it's the same idea. The Lord will see. Now, when you say, why did they translate it provide? Because if I say, like, I'm going to see to dinner, that means I'm going to provide dinner. So it has the same idea, but I want you to catch the seeing theme, because that's what's here. The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it will be seen. My translation says provided, but seen is the literal meaning of that. And the reason I point that out is because when I get to the New Testament, Jesus references Abraham and his story. And Jesus says, speaking to other Jewish people, your father rejoiced to, do you see it? Rejoiced to see my day. And he saw it. and was glad. And as soon as they hear seen, they know that it's the same word. The Lord will provide, the Lord will see to it. Um, they know that takes them back to Genesis chapter 2. And he saw it and was glad. Verse 57, so the Jews said to Jesus, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Abraham was like 2,000 years before Jesus. Verse 58, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And we're going to see that I am is used when we get to Exodus, where God is going to say of himself, I am that I am. I am the one that provided a sacrifice. Indeed, I am the sacrifice. But we'll see that in a future class.